everyone and welcome to my second video on how to concretely exploit your micro and low stakes opponents. Today I'm going to give you an example that really works against regulars at these stakes. In my coaching methodology, first I make sure that you are theoretically sound to then provide you with all the lines where your opponents underbluff, overbluff, undercall, overcall, so you know how to play against them. I have been working on a program as well that basically will teach you the same as the major CFPs teach you, as I have data on all the lines, be it from recreational or regular players. If you're interested, message me and tell me whether you want to work on your overall game or whether you just want the exploitative program. But now let's have a look at this example on how to exploit regulars. On the right you see our hand, on the left you see the ranges, so you can follow how you should theoretically play the hand. This is very important, as against regular players you should have a theoretical sound pre-flop, flop and turn game, and then on the river you can max exploit them in the micro and low stakes. So our hand on the right is 10-6 suited. Is it an open or isn't it an open? Have a look at the ranges on the left and you see that 10-6 suited is a pure open. If you're in doubt in these spots, there's a misconception of people thinking the micros, the rake is high, so you have to open very tight. That's completely wrong, and I might make a video on this. If you're in doubt whether your hand is an open or a fold, look at who is playing in the blinds, who are your opponents. Against almost everyone, if you're opening on the small blind, you can still open slightly more than your small blind open ranges, and on the button also a little bit more is no problem. So 10-6 suited is an open pure, which we do here and get confirmed by GTO Wizard. Now let's see what happens on the flop. Big blind calls pre-flop, checks to us, and the board is 10-7-2 rainbow. We hold 10-6 suited, so we have top pair, backdoor flush draw, and a weak kicker. Now what to do? Check, c-bet, if so what size? Being theoretical sound here doesn't mean that recognize that on GTO Wizard you could use several sizes on this board and therefore start mixing every single size and check back. No, it just means to have one size that is theoretical sound and construct your range well between check backs and c-bet, so that you play turns fine after c-bet, as well as when you face a check raise or when you check back your range is somewhat solid. So here I prefer a little bit larger sizes, but since many of you watching will use smaller sizes, I prefer to choose an example where we c-bet for the small 1/3 size. GTO Wizard of course confirms that our size is okay, as well as larger sizes, but our hand could also be a check back. This is the way this game works. Sometimes several options are equally good. But now let's have a look at the turn, which brings the queen of clubs. Our opponent called against our c-bet and checks to us on the turn. Everything looks quite solid here, but stay tuned as the hand will get exciting on the river. Now what's our strategy on this queen, which is an overcard that doesn't complete any draw? Typically on these overcards you can have two sizings, you can have an overbet or a normal bet size. On this queen specifically, I like overbets or checkbacks only. What does the overbet or checkback strategy mean? It means you're starting to polarize, so you're going to bet some very strong hands together with weaker hands that accompany it. Those can be draws like flush draw, straight draw, but also some random hands, ideally at a higher frequency hands that don't block your opponent's folds. Now what about our 10-6 suited? The ranges on the left tells us that we could sometimes bet it and mostly check it back, so I'm going to use a filter. Now the ranges are filtered for all of our hands except for flush draws, because given the board has a 10 of hearts, we could have 10 plus flush draw in our hands. Any 10x combo with two clubs would be second pair plus flush draw. And now you see the range on the left, 10-6 suited is all green, so it's a pure check back with our hand. Why is this? Because we're having a more polarized strategy, so we want to bet ideally top pair plus, so especially nicer queens and stronger hands. It is possible to still bet some hands like pocket jacks, 10 ace, 10 king, but given our opponents tend to overbluff the river when we check back, I recommend to include these hands a little bit more in the checking back range compared to GTO and be even more polarized. Now with our 10-6, like we already mentioned, it is a pure check back, which means check 100% of the time, as you can see here. Now things will get more interesting as we see the river. Our opponent checks to us again, the river is a 5 of spade, and we are not going to check back our hand. We are not going to talk about the bet check bet line, which many of you will look. It will get more interesting. So if you think this hand is a check back, after our opponent checks twice to us, our hand here according to GTO is a value bet. If you have a look at the ranges on the left, all of our 10x combo have to be bet. I'm not going to do anything differently, but think about your opponents. if they are on the button and they are not betting the tens here, it is possible that their value range is too small and they tend to be over bluffing. But this is what you should be paying attention to on the big blind, which is not what we are talking about today. We are the button, we have been theoretically sound, and we are going to use a size that many of you would use at least similarly, which is the 60% option that is given to us here and is correct. But now what is going to happen? What is our opponent going to do? He is finding the check raise. Now what do we do with our 10-6 facing this check raise? Do we call or do we fold? This is where we're going to exploit our micro low stakes opponents, and the answer may be different than what you imagine. So according to the range on the left, 10-6 suited is a little bit of green, some blue, so we could call or we could fold. So it's like rock, paper, scissors. We can choose whichever we want, but we mix it. We can't always call, we can't always fold, otherwise we'd be either calling too much or folding too much. But on the river in this spot, there's a clear tendency, according to data, that opponents are doing something differently here. They are not balanced, and this can be exploited. The incorrect way to try to exploit your opponent is to look at his raising stat to see whether he's raising too much or too little. Instead, for you to understand, let's first think about his checking range on the river. So this is the checking range before we bet on the river. The 5 of spade came, and our opponent had to decide whether he checks or he bets. This is the overall range with all the hands he should be getting there, but have a look at the sets and the 2 pair. If you filter sets and 2 pair, his strategy is going to be roughly 50-50 in terms of whether he should be checking or whether he should be betting these hands. The EV of checking these very strong hands for the big blind, at least in theory, is going to be the same as betting, because when the big blind checks and the button bets, the big blind has the option to check raise. If the big blind is building a proper strategy here of betting most, if not all, of the top pair and the second pair very frequently, but checking half of his very strong hand, especially the sets almost always checking, he could go for a check raising strategy that contains some huge check raises. So he can just, despite the pot being small here, check raise all in with his sets, forcing the button to call down. In real life, against opponents who check back too much second pair, you could debate whether you want to bet the sets more frequently. But what is more important for our line today is that the big blind in real life does bet those much more frequently. So he's not checking his strongest hands half of the time, he's not checking his set almost pure here, and he is likely going to be betting less of his top pair and second pair. So his checking range will contain more top pair, second pair, and less sets and 2 pair. His weakest hands, like king high or no mate hand, as you can see, should almost all be bet. Now think with me. We are the button, we saw big blind's checking range, and we are facing this raise, we have the 10-6. Are we expecting our opponent, especially for this size, to have many sets? Or to have too many 2 pair? Well, he checked. So we know that our opponent bets too frequently with the sets and the 2 pair. So can he check raise many of them? Yeah, sure. The ones he checked, he will check raise, but he checked them too little in the first place. Now the top pair that he used instead as a check. His top pair here is a decent check raise. If you build a strategy with checking top pairs here, you could still check raise top pairs as the big blind. Is our opponent likely going to check raise top pairs as frequently as GTO in this spot? No, he is not. Plus, there are different sizing options. So if our opponent theoretically knows that he could be shoving a set here, in this case he is not shoving, but he is using a normal raise size. So it is not important for us to analyze whether our opponent is raising too much or too little, but how his range is constructed. Due to the first check containing less of the strong hands, our opponents on average, when they check raise for this size here, are not containing enough of the very strong hands, as they're not doing it with top pair enough and they don't have enough sets in this line. So overall, regardless of your opponent being over raising, under raising here, so more frequently or less frequently than GTO, what we know according to mass data analysis is that this raising range is too weak. So in short for you, whenever you're playing in the micro low stakes against a regular, you c-bet the flop for 1/3. On the turn he checks and you check back. On the river he checks again, you bet for a normal bet size such as 60% and he raises for a normal size. Data shows us that this is going to be overbluffed, and when people overbluff, you need to overcall. So on the left you see that 10-6 suited is recommended to fold more than to call, the EV being the same. Now with this in mind on how population plays, the correct answer is to call these hands always. Please remember that in this example we are talking about micro and low stakes button against big blind, the big blind being the average regular. So of course if you have notes on your regular that he is going to be extremely nitty, he never wins when he sees the flop in an extreme example, then he always wins at showdown. Then you can still overfold in some spots. But the average regulars, if you play on an anonymous side for example, or a side without a HUD, and you have no info on the reg at the low and micro stakes, he will be overbluffing here. Why do I say micro and low stakes? Because at 200 NL plus, let's use 200 NL as more or less the threshold, people get more aware of the range constructions or how they should be constructing the checking range in the first place on the river, so it's less likely that you find a regular who's overbluffing there as much as on the low stakes. But still the opposite is hardly true of people underbluffing here even at the higher stakes. And the way data works is you need to separate spots. So I'm not saying river raises are too weak. Very careful. I'm talking this very specific situation where we are button against big blind 1/3 c-bet, turn check check, and on the river we bet 60%. It's not like river 3-bet pot after we bet flop, bet turn, bet river, they raise, we need to call because they are too weak when they raise rivers. No, I'm not saying they're too weak when they raise rivers. I'm saying that in this specific spot, they are too weak when they raise for this size, and therefore we are going to overcall and have a plus EV call with our 10-6. And this is the way you exploit your opponents. You see how regulars are playing, you see how recreational players are playing, you get all the data, you build a strategy that exploits your average opponent, and then if you have notes on your opponents, stats on your opponents, you can put your opponents, so even regulars and recreational players, you can divide them into different categories and exploit them even more. Luckily, this example is good for all player types, so in real life, without any hesitation, do as I do here and pure call these type of hands. If you want to see a few more of these examples in the next videos for free, it's important for me that these videos get watched, so please share these videos, thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you want all the exploitative lines that you usually only get in the big CFPs, just contact me for coaching and I'll be here. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.